If you stand in a flat field east of the Mississippi River, just across the water from the modern city of St. Louis, and you look northeast, you will see what appears to be a low, broad, grassy hill. It is wide, several football fields wide at its base. It rises about 30 meters above the surrounding plain in a series of broad terraces with a flat top. From a distance, it looks like a piece of geography, like something the river or the wind or the long patience of glaciers might have left behind. It is none of these things. The hill is not a hill. It was built by hand. Basket of earth by basket of earth, carried up the slope on the backs of human beings over a span of a few centuries that ended around the year 1350. The hill is the largest earthen structure ever built in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. It contains over 620,000 cubic meters of soil. It was the centerpiece of a city. The city, in the year 1100 of the Common Era, had a population of somewhere between 15 and 40,000 people, depending on whose estimates you trust. It was the largest city north of central Mexico. It was probably larger than London at the same date. And almost no one alive today, including the people who live within sight of its mounds, knows what it was called by the people who built it. The site is called Cahokia. The name is not its own name. The actual people who built and lived in this city left no written records. Their language is not preserved. They had no descendants we can definitely identify, because the city was abandoned 300 years before Europeans arrived in this region, and by the time French explorers reached the area in the 17th century, the land was occupied by a different indigenous group called the Cahokia, a small band of the Illinois Confederacy. The French wrote down the name they were given by these later inhabitants. The mounds were already there. The Cahokia people of the 1600s did not claim to have built them. They knew nothing about who had. The ruins were old. So the city we call Cahokia is named for a group of people who came along centuries after it was already gone. Whatever its inhabitants called themselves, and whatever they called their city, those names have not survived. What has survived is the architecture. 80 mounds at the central site, originally more than 120 before 19th century farming and 20th century industrial sprawl, flattened many of them. A central plaza of about 19 hectares, 50 acres, the size of around 40 soccer pitches laid side by side, that was rigorously level, rigorously rectangular, and rigorously aligned to the cardinal directions. Residential districts that extended for kilometers in every direction from the central plaza. A wooden palisade that, for at least part of the city's history, encircled the urban core. Suburbs across the river. Satellite settlements at distances of dozens of kilometers, all sharing a unified architectural and ceremonial vocabulary. We are not talking about a chiefdom of a few hundred people in a stockaded village. We are talking about a city, in every reasonable definition of the word. Tens of thousands of inhabitants, specialized neighborhoods, monumental civic architecture, a planned grid, long-distance trade, religion practiced at scale, hierarchy expressed in the use of space, the works of an administrative center whose authority extended across hundreds of kilometers of the Mississippi watershed. And the most extraordinary thing is the timeline. This city did not arise gradually, the way most ancient cities did. It did not emerge over 1,000 years of slow agricultural intensification. It was built in something close to its mature form in a single human generation. Archaeologists have a name for this. They call it the Cahokia Big Bang. Around the year 1050 of the Common Era, the population of the area exploded. Massive earthworks were constructed in coordinated large-scale projects. The plaza was leveled. Monks Mound, the great central pyramid we will return to in a moment, began rising. Within a few decades, what had been a region of small villages had become the most populous urban center in North America. Then, 300 years later, also rapidly, it was gone. By the year 1400, the central city was abandoned. The mounds were left in place. The houses were not. The civilization fragmented and dispersed. The descendants moved south, north, east, west, blending into other indigenous nations of the eastern woodlands and the plains. By the time Hernando de Soto's expedition crossed the lower Mississippi in 1540, the Cahokian civic order was 3 centuries gone. This is the story of a city that almost no one in the modern Western imagination knows existed. By the end of the next hour, you will know its founding, its layout, its religion, its astronomy, its burials, its trade, its collapse, and the strange, deliberate forgetting that has surrounded it ever since. To understand Cahokia, you have to understand what it grew out of and how fast. The Mississippi River Valley had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years before Cahokia rose. Its inhabitants, in the centuries before the Big Bang, were practicing a way of life archaeologists call the late woodland tradition. Small villages of 50 to 200 people. Mixed economies of hunting, fishing, foraging, and limited agriculture. Pottery. Earthen burial mounds, but small ones, a few meters tall, scattered across the landscape, used for periodic ceremonial gatherings of dispersed communities. There were trade networks, but they were limited. There was social hierarchy, but it was not strongly expressed. The late woodland period in the central Mississippi Valley was, by all measures, a sustainable, modestly stratified, dispersed lifestyle that had been working for centuries. Then, in the middle of the 11th century, something changed. Around the year 1050, archaeologists see a sudden, dramatic shift in the archaeological record of the American bottom, the broad floodplain of the Mississippi, where Cahokia would rise. New pottery styles appear. New house construction methods appear. The population of the area appears to roughly double, then triple in a few decades. People are arriving from elsewhere, diaspora communities from neighboring regions, drawn by something happening at this central place. There is monumental construction at a scale never before attempted in this part of the continent. The Grand Plaza is created, a massive, deliberate flattening of an existing landscape, with thousands of cubic meters of earth removed and redeposited to produce a perfectly level civic space. The first stages of Monks Mound begin to rise. Maize agriculture, which had been present in the region for some time, but at modest intensity, suddenly becomes the dominant subsistence base. The diet of Cahokian people, as readable from isotope analysis of skeletal remains, shifts dramatically toward maize. This is significant. Maize agriculture, when intensified, produces population surpluses that smaller-scale subsistence cannot. It also concentrates labor and food in centralized stores that can be redistributed. Maize in the central Mississippi Valley, after 1050, makes Cahokia possible. But maize alone does not explain the suddenness. The intensification of maize agriculture had been a gradual process across the eastern woodlands for centuries. Other groups had adopted it without producing anything like Cahokia. Something else happened around 1050 on this site that turned a normal late woodland village into the largest urban center in pre-Columbian North America in less than 100 years. Archaeologists debate exactly what triggered the Big Bang. The leading hypotheses are religious, a charismatic leader or movement that drew followers from across the eastern woodlands. Cosmic, a celestial event, possibly a supernova, that may have given religious authority to a particular interpretation of the sky. A successful consolidation that absorbed neighboring communities under a single coordinating authority, or some combination of these. Whatever the trigger, the result was unambiguous. A movement happened in the year 1050 in the floodplain east of where St. Louis now stands. The result of that movement was a city. There is one piece of evidence worth mentioning specifically. The supernova of 1054, known to modern astronomers as the supernova that produced the Crab Nebula, was visible on Earth for nearly 2 years. It was bright enough to be seen in daylight. It was recorded by Chinese astronomers, by Arab astronomers, by Anasazi rock artists in the American Southwest. It would have been spectacularly visible to the people of the central Mississippi Valley. There is no direct evidence that the Cahokian Big Bang was triggered by this supernova, but the timing, 1054 supernova, 1050 city emergence, is suggestive. Some scholars have argued that an event of this kind, interpreted within the cosmological framework of a religious movement already in motion, could have provided the spiritual authority for the consolidation that followed. We cannot know. We can note that it happened. Whatever the spark, the fire took. At the heart of Cahokia stands Monks Mound. It is the structure we glimpsed in the opening. The broad, terraced rise across the river from St. Louis. We need to spend time with it, because nothing about the site can be understood without it. Monks Mound is approximately 300 meters long on its base, 240 meters wide, and 30 meters tall. It rises in 4 broad terraces. Its volume is around 620,000 cubic meters of earth, approximately 1,370,000,000 pounds of soil, lifted by hand, in baskets, by human laborers over the course of roughly 250 years. The name Monks Mound has nothing to do with its original purpose. In the early 1800s, French Trappist monks established a monastery on the second terrace of the structure. They were there for only a few years. The monastery did not survive, but the name stuck in colonial-era documents, and the structure has been called Monks Mound ever since. It bears no resemblance to whatever its original Cahokian name was. The construction is layered. Archaeological excavations have revealed at least 14 distinct construction phases, each separated by a period of use, often marked by a hardened soil layer or a buried structure. The earliest phase began before the Big Bang of 1050, when a smaller, simpler mound stood in approximately the same location. After the Big Bang, the construction accelerated dramatically. Successive generations added new fills, expanded the footprint, raised the height, reshaped the terraces. The mound, in its final form, was the result of centuries of coordinated labor across multiple administrations of Cahokian authority. What makes Monks Mound especially interesting is the engineering. The structure is built on relatively soft, alluvial soil, the floodplain of one of the largest river systems in the world. To build a 30-meter mound on such ground without it slumping or tilting requires careful management. Cahokian engineers used alternating layers of clay and sand with internal drainage channels to maintain the structural integrity of the mound through wet seasons and dry. The clay layers were impermeable, redirecting groundwater. The sand layers between them allowed pressure equalization. This is sophisticated soil engineering. We sometimes underestimate indigenous American engineering because the materials they used were not stone. But earth, properly managed, is one of the world's most durable building materials. Monks Mound has stood for nearly 1,000 years. It is still there. It still drains correctly. On the summit, in the years of Cahokia's height, stood a wooden building. Archaeologists know this from post holes. The dark soil stains where massive timber posts once held up a structure of considerable size. The summit building was probably the residence of the city's paramount leader, sometimes called by archaeologists the Great Sun, by analogy with later southeastern chiefdoms that used similar titles. The building would have been the highest occupied structure in the city, visible from kilometers away, a constant assertion of where political and religious authority resided. To stand on the summit of Monks Mound today, looking out across the modern industrial sprawl of metropolitan St. Louis, is to perform a small act of imagination. Strip the highways, strip the factories, strip the suburbs, replace them with a planned grid of houses, with smoke rising from thousands of cooking fires, with a great plaza below the mound thronged with people, with smaller mounds rising at calculated intervals across the landscape, with the wide brown sweep of the Mississippi to the west. That was the view. The city was, from this perspective, a structured, dense, populated landscape, all built around the platform on which you are standing. The mound was the spine of the city, but it was not the city. Below Monks Mound, extending hundreds of meters to the south, lay the Grand Plaza, the level, open, ceremonial heart of Cahokia. The Grand Plaza is one of the most overlooked feats of pre-Columbian engineering. Cahokian planners began with an existing landscape that was naturally undulating, small swales, low rises, drainage channels, and they removed all of it. Tens of thousands of cubic meters of earth were excavated from the high spots and redeposited in the low spots until the entire surface was leveled to within a few centimeters across 19 hectares. The result was a perfectly flat ceremonial space, rectangular, oriented with its long axis on a north-south line. This plaza was the civic and religious focal point of Cahokia. The largest gatherings of the city's inhabitants happened here. Major ceremonies, athletic competitions, trade fairs, public executions possibly, the redistribution of food and goods. Whatever the specific functions, the plaza was where Cahokia, as a community, became visible to itself. Tens of thousands of people gathered into one continuous space, organized by clan and rank and ritual, performing the social rituals that defined what it meant to be Cahokian. Around the plaza were arranged smaller mounds, dozens of them, each with its own ceremonial or political function. Some were burial mounds, holding the remains of high-status individuals and their associated grave goods. Some were platform mounds, supporting wooden structures that served as temples, council houses, or elite residences. Some were ridgetop mounds with elongated profiles whose specific purposes are still debated. The arrangement was not random. The mounds were placed in patterns that aligned with cardinal directions, with solstice positions, with sight lines that we are still recovering through detailed survey work. Beyond the plaza, the residential city extended outward in every direction. Excavations have shown a planned urban layout, neighborhoods of houses arranged in regular grids, separated by avenues, with their main entrances oriented to the central plaza. Houses were built in a distinctive Cahokian style, rectangular with walls of woven cane and clay daub, with thatched or bark roofs with a central hearth, but built to a common pattern that suggests centralized planning, or at least strong cultural conventions about what a Cahokian home should look like. The city had at least 4 named precincts, which archaeologists have provisionally labeled by their compass orientations. The central precinct on the eastern side of the plaza, the residential west precinct across the plaza, the north precinct around what is now called the North Plaza, and a south precinct toward the Mound 72 complex. There may have been additional districts that have not been clearly identified. The city extended at full population over an area of approximately 15 square kilometers, comparable to the largest medieval European cities of the same century. There was, at least for part of the city's history, a wooden palisade encircling the central precinct. 2-meter thick log walls, with bastions every 20 meters, made of approximately 20,000 mature trees. The palisade was rebuilt several times during the city's life, each rebuilding using fresh timber. It enclosed the most prestigious zones of the city: Monks Mound, the Grand Plaza, the major elite residences, and excluded the surrounding residential districts. The palisade is one of the more puzzling features of Cahokia. It implies a defensive concern, but the archaeological record shows no clear evidence of large-scale military attack. It may have been defensive in intent. It may have been ceremonial, a way of marking sacred space. It may have been both. What is clear is that Cahokia was not an organic, accreted, gradually evolved settlement. It was a planned city, built to a vision. The vision was carried out by tens of thousands of people, coordinated by an administration that we still do not fully understand, but whose structural decisions are visible everywhere in the layout that survives today. About 1.5 kilometers west of Monks Mound, in a part of the site that is now mostly farmland, archaeologists in the 1960s found something unexpected: a series of large circular features in the soil, perfectly aligned arcs of post holes, each roughly 40 centimeters in diameter, each spaced precisely from its neighbors. The circles were enormous. The largest was about 120 meters in diameter. The posts that had once stood in those holes were massive, mature, red cedar trees, possibly imported from forests 60 kilometers north of the city. Archaeologists call these structures Woodhenge. They were astronomical instruments. The Cahokian Woodhenges. There were at least 5 of them constructed in succession, at the same general location, with the circles being expanded and reconfigured over time, appear to have been used to track the movements of the sun. Specific posts within the circles align with the position of sunrise on the equinoxes and on the solstices when viewed from a designated central observation post. On the spring and autumn equinoxes, the sun rises directly behind the central post of the largest circle, viewed from the perspective of the observation post. On the summer solstice, it rises on a different bearing, marked by a different post. On the winter solstice, the same. This is not coincidence. The construction is precise to within a fraction of a degree. The Cahokian engineers who laid out Woodhenge were tracking the cycle of the year through a fixed astronomical infrastructure. They were producing a calendar. What the calendar was used for, we can mostly only guess. Almost certainly it was tied to agricultural timing, when to plant maize, when to harvest, when to expect the spring and autumn floods of the Mississippi. Almost certainly it was tied to ceremonial timing, when to hold the great seasonal festivals, when to perform the rituals that kept the cosmic order in alignment. Almost certainly it was tied to political timing, the moments when the paramount leader's authority was renewed in public ceremony, when the cycle of obligation between elites and commoners was reaffirmed. The Woodhenges were rebuilt several times over the lifetime of the city. Each rebuilding shifted the configuration slightly, sometimes adding posts, sometimes adjusting the alignments. This is consistent with a tradition of careful astronomical observation, refining the calendar over generations as observations accumulated and small inaccuracies were corrected. The Cahokian astronomers were not making a one-time monument. They were maintaining an instrument. Like a modern observatory, the structure was upgraded as understanding improved. This is one of the things people miss about pre-Columbian North America. There was an active, sophisticated astronomical tradition in the eastern woodlands, comparable in its rigor to the better-known traditions of the Maya or the Anasazi. The Cahokian Woodhenge is the most spectacular surviving example we have, but it was not the only such site. Across the Mississippian world, smaller circular post structures and aligned mound complexes track astronomical events with care. The sky was the basis of the calendar. The calendar was the basis of the agricultural and ceremonial year. And the ceremonial year was the basis of the social order. Cahokia was, in this sense, a city that knew where the sun was. It knew where it would rise tomorrow. It knew when the longest day of the year would arrive. And it had built in cedar timber an instrument that demonstrated this knowledge to anyone who came to watch. Now we come to the most difficult part of the Cahokian story, the part that makes the modern visitor pause, the part that, when you walk the site today, the interpretive plaques mention with care. In 1967, archaeologists working on Mound 72, a relatively small ridgetop mound about a kilometer south of Monks Mound, uncovered a burial. The burial turned out to be one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds ever made in North America. At the center of the mound was a single individual, an adult male, approximately 40 years old at the time of death, laid carefully on his back on a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads. The beads had been arranged in the form of a stylized bird, the body of a falcon or a thunderbird, with the man positioned as the head of the figure. Around him were placed objects of remarkable wealth: copper sheets from the Great Lakes region, mica from the Appalachians, projectile points from across the eastern United States, hundreds of arrows arranged in bundles of 50. The man, sometimes called by archaeologists the beaded burial or the Birdman, was clearly a person of paramount status. He was not buried alone. Mound 72 contains the remains of more than 250 individuals, distributed in a series of pits and burial layers, around and below the central beaded burial. The other individuals show patterns that have been interpreted as evidence of human sacrifice. Most are young women, adolescents, between the ages of about 15 and 25. Many were buried in mass graves of 50 or more individuals laid in rows. Some show signs of strangulation. Some show signs of execution by sharpened stake. Several pits contain individuals with severed heads or hands, placed alongside the headless body in deliberate arrangements. The interpretation of these burials is a matter of careful, ongoing scholarship. The most widely accepted interpretation is that they represent dedicatory sacrifices, the killing of selected individuals as part of the ceremonial proceedings around the burial of a paramount leader, or around the renewal ceremonies that affirmed the cosmic order. Similar practices on a smaller scale are documented in later Mississippian and southeastern chiefdoms. The beaded burial, in this interpretation, was not a single death and entombment, but the focal event in a much larger ritual program that involved the deaths of dozens of subordinate individuals. This is uncomfortable to contemplate. It is also true. Cahokia was a society organized along sharp lines of hierarchy. The paramount leader, whoever he was, exercised authority that included the power to compel subordinate deaths in ritual contexts. The young women who died in Mound 72 did not consent in any way that we would today recognize as consent. They were taken from somewhere, possibly from outside the city, possibly tribute populations from satellite communities, and they were killed for the ceremonial purposes of the city's elite. This does not, however, make Cahokia uniquely brutal. Most large, complex pre-modern societies practiced some form of dedicatory sacrifice or ritual execution. The Aztecs are the most famous American example, but the practice was widespread, including in the medieval Christian and Islamic worlds in their judicial and political executions, in dynastic Egyptian and Chinese burial practices, in the funeral rites of European Iron Age societies. Mound 72 places Cahokia firmly within the typology of large hierarchical pre-industrial societies. It is not especially shocking when viewed in that comparative context. It is shocking only when measured against a romantic notion that pre-Columbian indigenous societies were uniformly egalitarian, peaceful, and consensual. Like all human societies at this scale, they had hierarchy, coercion, violence, and ritual death. What Mound 72 tells us, beyond the individual horror of the deaths, is that Cahokia was a society capable of organizing dedicatory sacrifice on a scale that required considerable institutional infrastructure. The acquisition of the victims, the ritual preparation, the construction of the burial pits, the deposition of the bodies in symbolic arrangements, all of this required coordinated effort, social authority, and shared belief about why such killings were necessary. This is not the work of a small village. It is the work of an urban civilization with the apparatus of state-level religion. It also raises a question we will return to in a few sections. How long does any society sustain a system that kills its own subordinates at this scale before that system fractures, because Cahokia did fracture? And the timing of that fracture, looking back, is suggestive. If you could walk through Cahokia at noon on a midsummer day in the year 1150, you would walk through a city that does not match anything you imagine when you imagine pre-Columbian North America. You would smell smoke, thousands of cooking fires, burning continuously, their plumes rising over the rooftops of the residential districts and merging into a thin haze over the plaza. The smell would be a mix of wood smoke, roasted maize, fish from the river, the slightly burnt fat of deer meat being smoked for storage, animal smell from the small enclosures behind residences where dogs were kept, the faintly sour smell of the latrine pits dug at the edge of every neighborhood, the wet smell of the river half a kilometer to the west. You would hear sound, tens of thousands of people in close proximity to one another, none of them in vehicles, none of them on phones, all of them communicating face to face. The sound of a Cahokian neighborhood would be a continuous, lively layer of voices, hammering, the thud of pestle against mortar in maize processing, the calls of children, the barking of dogs, the rhythmic music of stone against shell, or shell against shell, as ornaments were finished, drumming in the distance from one of the ceremonial precincts, singing sometimes. The acoustic environment of the city would be rich, dense, and very far from silent. You would see people. The streets would be crowded. Cahokian dress was elaborate and varied. Shirts and skirts of woven plant fiber and tanned hide, with regional variations in cut and decoration. Ornaments of shell, copper, freshwater pearl, polished stone. Tattoos in distinctive patterns that may have indicated clan affiliation, age, status, or accomplishment. The most elite individuals wore copper plates, falcon-shaped headdresses, mica discs. They walked through the city accompanied by attendants, retainers, or family members of lower status. The hierarchy of Cahokian society was visible in every public encounter. You would walk past markets. Trade goods from across the eastern half of North America moved through Cahokia continuously. Copper from the upper Great Lakes, pure native copper, beaten into sheets, traded 1,000 kilometers south. Mica from the southern Appalachians, used for ceremonial ornaments, traded several hundred kilometers west. Marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico, lightning whelk, busicon, prized for ornaments and for ritual containers. Chert from quarries in southern Illinois and northern Indiana, worked into projectile points and tools. Salt from the Saline River. Galena from the upper Mississippi for paint pigment. The trade network of Cahokia stretched continuously from the Atlantic to the prairies and from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. You would see craftspeople at work. Cahokia had specialized workshops. There were distinct neighborhoods where pottery was produced. Distinctive Cahokian ceramic traditions involving shell-tempered clay, fired at high temperatures with elaborate incised and painted decoration. There were neighborhoods where copper was worked, where shell beads were ground, where projectile points were knapped. The division of labor was elaborate. Most adult Cahokians had a specific craft or role within the community, in addition to participating in subsistence production. You would see agriculture, but at a scale that pre-Columbian eastern woodland societies had not previously achieved. The fields surrounding Cahokia stretched for kilometers in every direction. Maize was the dominant crop, but not the only one. Beans had recently begun to enter the agricultural complex and were planted alongside maize in ways that maximized yield. Squash, pumpkins, sunflowers, and a variety of native domesticated plants, chenopodium, marsh elder, knotweed, little barley, completed the agricultural inventory. Cahokian fields were productive enough to feed the densely concentrated urban population. Surplus from these fields was stored in central granaries, redistributed by the elite, and used to fund the construction projects that defined the city's monumental architecture. You would see religion practiced everywhere. Public ceremonies on the Grand Plaza with thousands of participants, smaller rituals at neighborhood mounds, personal devotion in domestic shrines, with figurines and ceremonial vessels, visible in the houses of nearly every excavated residence. The cosmology of Cahokia, as best we can reconstruct it, from the iconography on its pots, its sculpture, its mound layouts, was a tripartite cosmos, an upper world of celestial beings, a middle world inhabited by humans and their animals, and an underworld of chthonic beings and the dead. The paramount leader, the Birdman, was understood to mediate between these worlds. The Woodhenges synchronized human ritual with the timing of the upper world. The mounds materialized the relationship between earth, sky, and the dead. This was a city, not a town, not a chiefdom in the colonial era stereotype of feathered headdresses around a campfire. With urban density, urban specialization, urban hierarchy, urban infrastructure, urban religion. It happened to exist in North America, in a part of the world that European-descended history has trained itself not to recognize as a place that produced cities. But it was a city, and it had been one for 2 centuries before it began, in the early 1300s, to fall apart. Cahokia did not exist alone. Just as Doggerland was not the only thing the post-glacial floods drowned, just as Derinkuyu was one of hundreds of underground cities, Cahokia was the largest node in a much wider civilization that filled the Mississippi watershed and beyond. This civilization is called by archaeologists the Mississippian World. It was not a single political entity. It was a cultural sphere, a collection of related societies, sharing a common architectural vocabulary of platform mounds and palisaded centers, a common ceramic tradition of shell-tempered pottery, a common iconography of the Birdman cult, a common set of long-distance trade relationships, and probably a related, but not identical set of political structures. Mississippian centers extended from what is now Wisconsin in the north to coastal Florida in the south, and from the Atlantic seaboard in the east to the eastern margins of the Great Plains in the west. There were dozens of major centers besides Cahokia. Moundville in present-day Alabama was the second largest, with a population perhaps a tenth the size of Cahokia at its height, but with similarly elaborate plaza and mound architecture. Etowah in northern Georgia was a major southern center, with the famous engraved copper plates and Mississippian mortuary tradition burials. Spiro in Oklahoma contained one of the richest single mortuary deposits ever found in North America. Aztalan in Wisconsin was a smaller northern outpost with a palisaded compound that closely matched the architecture of the Cahokian core. These centers traded with one another. They shared ritual specialists? Possibly. They shared iconographic motifs that show coordinated religious vocabulary across distances of 1,500 kilometers. They were politically distinct. There is no evidence of an empire, no evidence of administrative subordination of one center to another, but they were clearly part of a connected world. Cahokia, at its height, sat at the center of this network. Goods flowed in. Ideas flowed in. Religious specialists may have come to Cahokia for training and returned to their home centers carrying Cahokian architectural and ritual practices. Cahokia influenced its neighbors more than they influenced it by virtue of its size and its prestige. There is suggestive evidence, though not conclusive, that some of the smaller Mississippian centers were colonies or daughter communities founded by people leaving Cahokia, carrying with them the founding cosmology and architectural vocabulary of the parent city. This means that the abandonment of Cahokia, when it came, was not the end of the Mississippian world. The smaller centers continued. Many of them experienced their own peaks of construction and population in the centuries after Cahokia declined. The collapse of the central node, instead of bringing down the whole network, redistributed Mississippian civilization across a broader, less hierarchical landscape. This is a pattern visible in many ancient civilizations. A paramount center fails, and the system reorganizes itself at a lower level of integration. The civilization doesn't die, it decentralizes. By 1540, when Hernando de Soto crossed the lower Mississippi River, several Mississippian-descended chiefdoms were still operating in the southeastern United States. De Soto's expedition encountered fortified towns with platform mounds, central plazas, paramount leaders, and elaborate ceremonial life. They saw Mississippian civilization in something close to its mature operating form, 300 years after Cahokia itself had been abandoned. What they did not realize, what they could not have realized, was that they were seeing the surviving fragments of a once larger system whose center had already fallen apart and whose memory had not been transmitted to any nation they could ask. So why did Cahokia fall? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. We have a list of probable causes, all of them plausible, all of them at work to varying degrees. The collapse was almost certainly multifactorial. Civilizations of this scale rarely die from a single shock. They die from compounding stresses, with the proximate cause being whichever stress finally broke the back of an already weakened system. The leading hypothesis is environmental. Cahokia was located in a floodplain. Its agricultural base depended on the productivity of that floodplain, on the regular spring floods of the Mississippi, which deposited fresh silt that renewed the fertility of the fields, but which also did not flood so severely as to destroy the crops. This balance was delicate, and over time it became less reliable. The medieval climate anomaly, which had warmed the northern hemisphere, from roughly 900 to 1250 Common Era, gave way around 1200 to a much wetter, cooler climate that would eventually deepen into the Little Ice Age. Increased rainfall in the upper Mississippi watershed produced more frequent and more catastrophic floods downstream. Tree ring data from the central Mississippi Valley shows a marked increase in extreme weather events, both floods and droughts, beginning in the late 1200s. For an agricultural city dependent on a stable floodplain, this would have been disastrous. Crops failed. Famines became more common. Storage stocks were drawn down. The social system that had been built on the assumption of agricultural surplus began to strain. The second factor is environmental degradation around the city. Cahokia, at its height, required enormous quantities of timber. The palisade alone consumed approximately 20,000 mature trees in each of its rebuildings. Houses required wood. Cooking fires required wood. The sustained demand for fuel and construction material would have deforested the landscape in an expanding ring around the urban core. Modern paleo-environmental reconstructions of the area surrounding Cahokia confirm this. The forests around the city were progressively cleared during its lifetime. By the early 1300s, large mature trees had to be sourced from progressively farther away, increasing the labor cost of every construction project. Soil erosion on the deforested slopes contributed to flooding in the lower fields. The carrying capacity of the local environment had been reduced by the city's own growth. The third factor is social and political. There is evidence that, around 1250, Cahokia experienced a period of internal conflict. The palisade was rebuilt with apparent urgency. Some neighborhoods show evidence of fire and abandonment. The paramount leadership of the city, whoever they were at this point, appears to have lost the capacity or the legitimacy to coordinate the labor projects that had defined the previous century. Elite burials become less elaborate. The construction of new mound phases slows. The city, as a coordinated political entity, was beginning to fragment. The fourth factor is religious or ideological. The system of authority at Cahokia depended on a cosmology that linked the paramount leader, the calendar, the sky, the ancestors, and the cycle of agricultural fertility. When that cycle broke down, when the floods came at the wrong time, when the harvest failed, when the children of elite families died of disease, the cosmological promise that had justified Cahokian authority would have been called into question. The dedicatory sacrifices at Mound 72 may have, at one time, seemed like a necessary maintenance of the cosmic order. By the early 1300s, with that order visibly failing, the ritual killings would have begun to look not necessary, but predatory. Subordinate populations may have, at this point, withdrawn their consent to the system. The legitimacy that had carried the city collapsed. The fifth factor is migration. Cahokia's population, after about 1250, shows a steady decline. People were leaving. Where did they go? Some moved to satellite communities. Some moved south into the lower Mississippi Valley, where Mississippian-style societies would persist. Some moved into the upper Mississippi Valley and the Great Lakes region. The diaspora of Cahokia is in many ways the founding event of the historic indigenous nations of the eastern woodlands. Many groups, possibly Osage, possibly Quapaw, possibly elements of what would become the Caddo Confederacy, have origin stories that trace their ancestors back to a great city in the river country, to the north or east. We cannot, with certainty, link any specific historic nation to Cahokia, but the descendants are out there, distributed across many groups, carrying fragments of the inheritance. By the year 1400, the central city was essentially empty. The mounds were intact. The plaza was leveled and unused. The houses were abandoned, their walls collapsing, the timber being slowly reclaimed by the soil. The palisade was either burned or simply rotting in place. The city was over. The civilization, in its central form, had ended. But the strangest part of the Cahokia story is not the end of the city. It is what happened after. When the first Europeans began penetrating into the central Mississippi Valley in the 17th century, French explorers, fur traders, Jesuit missionaries, they found the mounds. They saw them. They wrote about them. They camped on them in some cases. They asked the indigenous peoples of the region what the mounds were. The answers they received were not detailed. The indigenous peoples in the immediate vicinity of the mounds in the 17th century, the Cahokia, the Tamaroa, the Illinois, were a different population from the people who had built the mounds 3 centuries earlier. They knew the mounds were old. They had no detailed historical narrative about who had built them or why. The transmission had been broken. So the Europeans, looking at these massive earthworks, made up their own explanation. And the explanation they made up is one of the most enduring and damaging myths in American history. The myth was called the lost race of mound builders. According to this myth, which became wildly popular in 19th century America, the mounds of the Mississippi and Ohio valleys had been built not by indigenous Americans, but by some other, vanished, more sophisticated population. Welsh princes, lost Israelite tribes, Atlantean colonists, ancient Phoenicians, refugees from a sunken continent. The indigenous peoples of the region, according to the myth, had been incapable of building such structures. They had supposedly arrived later, after the original mound builders had been destroyed by some catastrophe and had occupied a landscape whose monumental architecture was not their own. This myth was incredibly convenient. It justified the dispossession of indigenous Americans by providing an ideological argument that the land had really belonged to a vanished, more deserving people, whose extermination was therefore an opening for the rightful European inheritors of advanced civilization. The myth had explicit political utility. It was promoted by writers, by politicians, by speculative archaeologists throughout the 19th century. It was reflected in the policies that justified Indian removal. It shaped popular understanding of pre-Columbian North America for decades. The myth was also wrong. Definitively, archaeologically, undeniably wrong. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the very indigenous peoples whose competence the myth was designed to deny. Cahokia was an indigenous American city. Its builders were ancestors of the Mississippian descended nations that the United States government was, in the same century, displacing onto reservations. By the early 20th century, professional archaeology had refuted the mound builder myth thoroughly. Cyrus Thomas's work for the Bureau of American Ethnology in the 1880s and 90s had already established that the mounds were indigenous in origin. Subsequent work has only confirmed and refined this. There is no scholarly debate today about who built Cahokia. The builders were ancestors of contemporary Native American nations, plain and clear. But the myth has not fully died. Even today, you can find online communities, books, video channels that promote variations of the lost race story, that argue Cahokia was built by ancient Egyptians, by escaped Hebrews, by some non-indigenous group. The underlying logic of these claims is the same logic that justified 19th century dispossession, that a sophisticated city in pre-Columbian North America cannot have been indigenous, and therefore must be attributed to some imagined non-indigenous source. Cahokia is the most direct rebuke to this logic that North American archaeology has produced. The site exists. It is documented. Its builders were indigenous Americans. Period. The persistent erasure of this fact in popular memory, the fact that the average American has never heard of Cahokia, the fact that the site is not in standard history textbooks, the fact that even people who live within sight of Monks Mound often do not know what they are looking at, is itself an artifact of the same colonial logic that produced the lost race myth in the first place. The forgetting of Cahokia is not an accident of historical chance. It is a consequence of how the United States was taught to remember its own past. This is one of the reasons the city deserves to be told and retold, not because it is shocking or because it is mysterious in some occult sense, but because it is real and indigenous and continuous with the people who are still here. The descendants of Cahokia walked into the modern era. They are still walking. The civilization fragmented, but did not vanish. The forgetting is what needs to end. So what does Cahokia mean? It means that the standard American story, the story in which civilization arrives with European ships and indigenous peoples, were nomadic occupants of a primordial wilderness, is wrong. It was wrong before any European set foot on the continent. There were cities here. There was urban planning. There was monumental construction. There was long-distance trade. There was astronomical science. There was institutional religion. There was political hierarchy with all of its costs. The Americas, before Columbus, were not empty. They were not technologically primitive. They were not waiting to be civilized. They had civilizations of their own, complete and complex, and frequently quite large. And Cahokia was the most spectacular surviving example of one of those civilizations in what is now the United States. It means that the trajectory of any civilization is more contingent and more reversible than we like to think. Cahokia was a city of tens of thousands of people, with monumental architecture, with sophisticated engineering, with a calendar, with religion, with trade, with all the apparatus of urban civilization. It existed for 3 centuries. Then, due to a compounding combination of environmental change, political stress, and possibly internal religious crisis, it ended. The buildings are still there. The descendants are still here. But the city, the institution, the ongoing civic life, that ended. Civilizations do that. Ours could too. It means that history is rarely transmitted across collapse intact. The Cahokian inheritance fragmented and dispersed into the diaspora communities that became the historic indigenous nations. Those communities preserved fragments, agricultural practices, ceremonial vocabulary, kinship structures, certain elements of cosmology, but they did not preserve the operating knowledge of Cahokia as a city. The descendants of Cahokia did not pass down to the 17th century French explorers a detailed history of the mounds, because that history had not been the kind of thing that survived the rupture. Civilizations, after they fall, are remembered in pieces, often inaccurately, often through later cultural lenses that distort what they were. It means, finally, that the recovery of forgotten civilizations is a political act as much as a scientific one. The Cahokia we know today is the result of more than a century of careful archaeology, much of it done in dialogue with indigenous descendant communities, and much of it consciously aimed at correcting the colonial era myths about who built the mounds. The site is now a state park. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is the subject of ongoing research that continues to refine our understanding of what was here. The work of remembering Cahokia is ongoing. It involves correcting both the simple ignorance of the average citizen, most Americans have never heard of it, and the more insidious ideological erasures that have shaped popular history. Both are part of what it means to know Cahokia. The city was built by indigenous Americans in the heart of what is now the United States, 1,000 years ago, on a scale that rivaled the largest cities of the contemporary world. It rose, it flourished, it ended. Its descendants are still here. Its mounds are still here. The grass on Monks Mound still cuts at the same angle it has cut for nearly a millennium. And every year, more is recovered of who its builders were and what they did and why it matters. The light at the top of Monks Mound, late on a summer afternoon, is the kind of light that does not photograph well. It is yellow, but with a green undertone from the grass. It is angled, but with the haze of Midwestern humidity blurring the angles. The air smells faintly of cut hay and faintly of river silt. The wind comes off the Mississippi from the west, carrying the sound of distant traffic from the highways that have replaced the city's outer suburbs. The traffic is not entirely incongruous. There is something fitting about the largest pre-Columbian city in North America being adjacent to the modern industrial sprawl that replaced the forests its builders had cleared. The land, in some sense, has remained urban. It has just changed who is doing the urbanizing. If you sit on the summit, on the grass, with your back to the wooden pavilion that the modern interpretive program has placed there, and you look out over the broad green space where the Grand Plaza once was, you can do a small act of imagination. You can put back the houses. You can put back the smaller mounds, the ones that 19th century plowing erased. You can put back the palisade. You can put back the smoke from thousands of cooking fires. You can put back the people walking on errands, gathering for ceremonies, trading, talking, complaining, falling in love, growing old, dying. You can put back the city. Cahokia is one of those places where the act of imagination is not strenuous. The structure is still here. The geometry of the mounds still produces the alignments their builders intended. Sunset on the equinox still falls behind the relevant Woodhenge post. The stage on which the urban drama played out is intact. The play itself is what has gone. But a stage is not nothing. A stage is what permits the imagination to work. Cahokia, by the simple act of remaining visible, Monks Mound, the Grand Plaza, Mound 72, the Woodhenge reconstruction, gives us the architecture for recognition. With the architecture, the rest can be reconstructed by careful scholarship and by patient attention. Without the architecture, nothing would be possible. The fact that the mounds were not, in the end, completely flattened by farming or industrial development is one of the small fortunes of American history. The descendants of the people who built Cahokia are alive. They live in Oklahoma, in the Dakotas, in Wisconsin, in Florida, in places far from Cahokia, and in places close to it. Some of them know that their ancestors came from the Mound Country. Some of them are working with archaeologists today to clarify what the city was. The work of Cahokia is not closed. It is ongoing, in the way the work of any great inherited place is ongoing, as long as anyone cares about it. And we should care. Because Cahokia is one of the clearest examples we have of how thoroughly history can be forgotten and how, with patient effort, it can be returned. The largest pre-Columbian city in North America was, until very recently, almost completely invisible to the general public of the country in which it stands. That invisibility was not natural. It was made. The visibility we have now was also made by archaeologists, by indigenous scholars, by the slow public work of correcting a story that had been wrong for a long time. Monks Mound is still there. The sun still sets behind the relevant post. The grass on the summit still bends in the same wind. 16 million people now live within 100 miles of the site. They mostly do not know that what they are passing on the highway is the largest earthen monument in their continent, the heart of a city that was, in its century, one of the great cities of the world. But the monument is patient. It has waited for 900 years. It can wait longer. The remembering, when it comes, has time to come.